Now let us open our Bibles to Zechariah 14. Today is our 26th and final study of this great book, which not only prepares our heart for the times to come, but even for the immediate moments for today. It provides us with a daily confirmation of the truth of the Scriptures as we see our world being continually destabilized in preparation for the final showdown and for that new world that is coming. Our chapter today brings us to 3 periods of time. The 7-year tribulation period, also the 1,000-year Messianic times, and the eternal state. First, we will discover more about the very end of the tribulation time. I want to tell you that here Zechariah is very graphic. It is, however, a time that would lead us right into the new and wonderful reality called the Millennium, or the Messianic age. We will also get another glimpse of the eternal state which follows the Millennium. The chapter then begins by telling us that the nation of the world will surround Jerusalem. They will attack and invade that city, an aggression that will trigger the second coming of the Messiah, where we read in verse 2 that his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. But what happens just before these long-awaited times? Zechariah uses 2 powerful verses to speak of the wrath of the war here. Verses 6 and 12. Let us read verses 6 and also verses 7 here. It says, "It shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light. The light will diminish. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night. But at evening time it shall happen that it will be light." Now first, I would like to draw your attention to how much of a contrast there is between verses 6 and 7. In verses 6, there's no light at all. And in verse 7, we now have a lot of lights. 24 daylight hours each day. How to put these two phenomena both on the same page and side by side? This is where we see, I want to tell you again, the grace and great sensitivity of our God in bringing us information of the end times, which verse 6 graphically, at least in the original text, as we're going to see, speaks of great havoc and destruction and darkness over all the earth. But right away, the Lord brings us to the eternal state where there will be light, always. And this light will be the glory of God as we see it in Revelation 22. As if he's telling us, yes, that will be bad. It'll be bad for a short period of time, but look at what is coming. Look at all these great things. And especially in this time, we must keep our eyes set on that refashioned and greatly refreshing future that is to come. So then verse 6 and 7 form 2 bookends. On the one edge, we have tribulation's fallout, while the other end, it speaks of a new eternally lit universe, but the Scriptures is not satisfied with just verse 7. It keeps on. After verse 7, verse 8, it speaks of living waters which shall flow from Jerusalem. Furthermore, verse 9 affirms the kingships of the Lord over the earth. Verse 10, we are brought to read very specific geographical spots, like an addresses he gives us, detail of how things will be changing in our millennial landscape. Then in verse 11, we hear of that rest, that shalom, where Jerusalem will dwell in safety, with the last words of this verse, Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. And we need to hear all these good things that are going to happen, because verse 12 brings us back to where we left off from verse 6, back to the reality of war, where God's wrath will be poured out upon the earth. Now let's then go back to verse 6 and see what we are told in this short but very loaded verse. "It shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light. The lights will diminish." The very first word speaks of darkness and follow a trail along with many other prophecies which speaks of those moments preceding the second coming, of these wars that are coming. To mention just a couple of them, God says through Joel the prophet that at this moment the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Joel 2:31. And then the Lord comes back. For it says right in the next verse, for whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, for in Mount Zion, in Jerusalem, there shall be deliverance. This is the same sequence or pattern that we find in verses 6 to 11 of Zechariah 14. While this darkness, which will blanket the skies, has a major place in Bible prophecies, being mentioned by Isaiah, but Zephaniah as well, it has been described by Yeshua himself in Matthew 24. We read in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. These are the words of Christ. And then right away, this verse, and following the same pattern found in the Hebrew scriptures, we read, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven in verse 30. Right? This darkness is a sure thing that will happen. But what? But what, we ask, will cause it to happen? Zechariah gives us one important information in verse 6. See the last words of this verse. The light will diminish, right? However, the original text is different. Let me show you how the Targum translates it. It keeps the meaning of the original text in Hebrew. It says, and it shall come to pass at that time that there shall be no light but cold and ice. This is what it says. Why speak of cold? Why speak of ice right here? You know, I don't want to be dogmatic about this verse, but the darkness and the sudden cold and ice reminds us of what a nuclear winter might look like, as described to us by the scientists. Last year in July of 2019, in the Journal of Geophysical Research Atmospheres, the researchers used modern climate models to calculate the effect of smoke from a nuclear explosion on Earth temperature, wind patterns, and more. After a nuclear explosion, the soot or the fine particles will cover the atmosphere and cause darkness, and at the same time they say that the temperature will dip to freezing year-long. They predict that the growing seasons will be cut by 90%, and most of the world will be plagued by famine. They have these weapons already. But whatever it is, whatever may cause the darkness, the suddenness of it all brings about the hasty coming of the Lord himself. For he said in Matthew 24:22, unless those days were shortened, no flesh, no man will be saved. And for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. God comes back to stop these wars. And the word kapha for ice in verse 6 is so interesting. It is only used 4 times and speaks mainly of the heart, of a heart being frozen to truth. In Zephaniah, the Lord will punish men who are stagnant, same word, or frozen in spirit. In Job 10:10, it speaks of his friends who were curdling him like cheese, a poetic way of saying that they were attempting to freeze his heart, in the same way as milk is turned into solid like cheese. Through this word, the rabbi sees the world in complete confusion. In Aramaic, this word came to describe an angry spirit. So would our world be if left by itself, if left in the hands of men. Thank God that Yeshua is coming to stop it. But there is much more to this darkness and to the coming of the light of God. This brings us right back to the beginning of Bible history, where sin first entered the universe. Do you remember where? This is when there was chaos and darkness on the face of the earth, and the Spirit of God and the light of God came to rearrange the fallen state, just like it will be in the Millennium. We read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, that after the creation of the heaven and the earth suddenly, the rabbi says, how come it became suddenly tohu vebohu? Without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Without form and void, tohu vebohu, destruction, darkness, emptiness. But see what happens right after. The same pattern in Matthew, the same pattern in Zechariah. First, and right away in the same verse, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of God, he's the first on the scene, and we are told that he was hovering over the face of the waters. And then in verse 3, we read, then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Yeshua said that he is the light of the world, and his light prevails over every darkness. The same light will triumph over the countries of the world, will battle each other, and will use whatever means they can to overthrow one another. We thank God again. We thank God, our Creator, who is so gracious that at the very end, he comes to stop this complete, really, nonsense. You know, I heard a story I want to share with you. It was a dark and stormy night when a woman and her child were on a boat crossing a dangerous strait. So the lightning, the thunder and the rain made her very nervous, and especially when she saw sharp and living rocks above the surface of the waters. In fear, she asked the captain, she says, do you know where all the rocks out there are? The captain replied, no, I don't, but I do know where it's safe to go. Okay? As we sail through life, we're going to see lots of rocks out there. I believe it will be in the increase as we go forward. The important thing is to know where it is safe to be. Yeshua knows the safe way. And if there is ever a time in history where we need to follow him, especially those who don't know him yet, it is now. Even through darkness, he always promises to guide and protect his precious sheep. While the ecclesia will be raptured before the time of the great darkness, the time of God's wrath, we must still know these things so we can pray, we can proclaim to the world who Yeshua is. There's yet another verse we need to deal with, one more that describes the dread of the end of the tribulation. One more verse before we can together enter that great and wonderful time to come. Let's read verse 12. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will dissolve in their sockets, and their tongues shall dissolve in their mouth. How does one read or explains this verse? See the suddenness of the event. As the soldiers were standing, their flesh dissolved, their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, and their tongue shall dissolve in their mouth. What does that bring to our minds? 3 times the word dissolve is mentioned, makak. In Hebrew, this word means to decay, but also to melt, to dissolve. And when there's a sudden blast of fire, as Isaiah describes the destruction of the heaven and the earth before the new heaven and the new earth will replace them. There God says in Isaiah 34:4, and all the host of heaven will what? Wear away, they will dissolve. And the sky will roll up like a scroll, and their host will wither away, and a leaf wither from the vine, as one withers from the fig tree. But how can we explain the quickness, the speed of that sudden dissolving and melting spoken of in Zechariah? Again, I definitely don't want to be dogmatic about it, but the description sounds so ominously close to what the scientists and history tell us about the devastation of a nuclear warfare. This past Thursday was the 75th birthday of the Hiroshima bombing. This is when a 150-meter wide ball of fire engulfed the center. Waves of 9,000 degrees centigrade heat were sent rolling across the city at speed of 4 kilometers per second. Then an atomic mushroom rose up miles above the city, which had already become a desert. Estimates of casualties vary from 100,000 to 200,000, and 30,000 and 70,000 at Nagasaki, in which another bomb was dropped a few days later. We're told that the survivors were soon shaken with heat, and listen to this, followed by cold. And I was taken by the description of some survivors as reported by the Japan Times. A description which sounds so much like Zechariah 14:12. I want to quote you what one said. One observer found 20 soldiers. And he said, their faces were wholly burned. Their eyes' sockets were hollow. The fluid from their melted eyes had run down their cheeks. Another one said, as we sat there, well shocked and confused, heavily injured, burned victims were stumbling into the bomb shelter en masse. Their skins had peeled off their bodies, and faces were hung leaping down on the ground in ribbons. I want to tell you, this is a reality we need to grasp in order to understand sin and the end-time prophecies as well. We cannot just block our ears to these things. They are real, and the solution is only found in the Lord. Only. This is when we want to run to God for safety. This is the very purpose of these descriptions. This is why they are given here in Zechariah. This is why they are so graphic. Some rabbis have seen the weight of these verses. Kimki, or the Radak, wrote in his commentary on Zechariah, he said, but at evening time it shall be light, at the time when the affliction is the greatest he ever read in the scriptures. And he says, when the city goes forth into captivity, then the Lord shall come forth and fight with those nations. This indeed will be the greatest of all afflictions the world will endure, just like Daniel said in chapter 12. And Jesus quoted him. And also Joel said that there will be never a time like this to come. We need to know these things. Let us remember that these words are man-made. They're not from God. He restrains them. But all this information must be familiar with those who read the account of the death of the Messiah, when he was taking all the sins of the world unto himself. Do you remember? The things which are described in Zechariah, the earthquake in verse 5, and the darkness in verse 6, happened in a much smaller scale when Yeshua was on the cross in order to warn the people. In Matthew 27:45, we read, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And verse 51, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. They were like a warning of things to come. Take Yeshua, or you're going to experience these things. By the way, at that time, there were no reports of injury in the gospel. For at his first coming, Yeshua was taking the whole brunt of sin on himself. These things then must have happened as a warning of things to come, things actually that we're reading right here in Zechariah. These tremors and darkness are two among the many signs used when the Lord attempted to call every soul unto himself. And he's doing it today. It is my prayer again, that these things will prompt everyone to listen to these prophecies, to quickly run to God for shelter and eternal salvation. Because you don't know when the end will be. Now here again we can see God's goodness. Right away. Right after these short verses, we read in verse 14. Judah also will eat and rejoice at Jerusalem. And the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold, silver, and apparel in great abundance. In your translation, you probably have written that Judah will fight. But the word here is lechem, which means to eat, which means to feast. And here we read that the nations of the world will be bringing gold and silver and apparel in great abundance in Jerusalem, for they would have realized that Yeshua is the King of Kings. And this goes on until the end of the chapter. Let's go back to verse 7. And begins to consider this great information we have about the great and wonderful future. That's part of the end-time prophecies, by the way. It is in this verse where we previously read that there will be a day of so much light, a light of truth and comfort. See how it describes this day now. For it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord. A unique day, Yom Echad. Yom Echad. One special day, never seen before. when the Lord will come and bring light, happiness, and when harmony will be reflected everywhere in the world. Now listen to this. From this verse, some rabbis concluded, including the Rashi, actually understood that the Messianic times will last 1,000 years. Okay, that's something, by the way. I want to tell you that's something. Relying on Moses' Psalm 90 verse 4, which says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night," and seeing that this day in Zechariah is echad, is unique, and speaks of a Messianic times, they calculated that it should be 1,000 years. Isn't this great? That they were able to figure out something like this through their cross-referencing and deep appreciation of the word. So how is it that today, when we have the revelation of the New Testament, which 3 times tells us that the Messianic times will last 1,000 years, that believers do just the opposite. And instead of taking the literal meaning, they allegorize the scriptures. They think we are right now in the Millennium, and that we're going to change the world. Today, many believe that Jesus already came back in 70 AD, at the time when the temple was destroyed. These preterists believe that the millennium began right there and then, that the 1,000 years is really an undetermined lapse of time during which the church will change the world and will bring peace everywhere. Well, good luck for this one. But see how some of these rabbis were right on target. Let me tell you, because it's not funny. Let me tell you how far they went in their research. I read one of their stories, which brings us right to 70 AD at the destruction of the temple. And this is what it says. It says, "When the flames engulfed the temple, 3 young priests went up to the roof and threw the keys of the house of God to heaven. A hand reached down and took the keys, and the priest said, 'How long? How long, O Lord?' And a heavenly voice issued and said, 'No longer than 2 days, my children.' They then knew that the exile of the Shekinah, and the dispersion of Israel since that time would only be 2,000 years. For it is written again in Psalm 94, 1,000 years in your sight as like yesterday." Right on target, right? The temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago, and soon, according to the end-time prophecy, the last 1,000 years of the millennium is about to happen after the tribulation. Very soon. Again, perhaps 7 years from now, if the rapture is tonight. And it is tonight, by the way. I don't know if you knew about this. And where are we in the map? You see this, the yellow arrow, right at the threshold of this great moment. Okay, right there. I believe that we are the generation who will experience such the great blessing of being taken up and looking and meeting the Lord. Now, going back to Zechariah, right after these descriptions come the very brighter side of the chapter. We are brought right into the Messianic age of the Millennium. Let me bring you right to verse 16, which says, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of the nation who came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of Sukkot," that is tabernacles. I want to tell you, this is some revelation we have here. All the nations of the world during the Messianic times will be required to go to Jerusalem to worship every year during the Feast of Tabernacles. Why the Feast of Tabernacles? This feast symbolizes the Messianic time. It is the 7th of the Holy Feast of Israel, just like a Shabbat celebrated on the 7th day of the week. 7, Sheva, is from the word Sava, meaning to be full, to be completed, from where we get our word Shabbat, for rest. This will be a real Shabbat. 7 then is the perfection of completeness of time in this case. So important in this feast, by the way, Sukkot, that in Leviticus 23, where you have all the feasts, right? It is called the Feast of the Lord, His own feast. Surely the Lord calls it that because He too is yearning for the time of peace and reunion with His children, with you. And in Leviticus 23, we find an exclusive commandment given in this feast. There God commanded the Israelites to rejoice, right? To be happy, to laugh, to cheer. That was the law. By the way, God gave no such commandment in other law, for the other feasts. The Talmud calls Sukkot the Chag, the feast, the festival by excellence, because they knew what it represents. They have read Zechariah 14. And during this time, by the way, the Jewish people were asked to live in flimsy booths, right? And I mean flimsy, right? For this was the law behind the building of the sukkah. It was a requirement so that when they lived in there for 7 days, they would be so uncomfortable that they would pray for the millennium to come first. That's the idea. Only God then is predictable. He's reliable. He's trustworthy. We have His word. This is where we are to go today.
Hallelujah.